Hey folks, David Stewart here. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about corporations up in their corporation buildings, being all corporation-y, make money, and corporatism. So as a libertarian, libertarians are often put in the position where we have to defend companies, corporations, or we have to defend the idea of corporations because they're bound up with this idea of capitalism, and we want to defend the free market, we want to defend freedom, and we want to defend people's financial freedom as well. And that's a little bit of a mistake, not in a tactical sense, but in a technical sense, because corporations themselves are not something that is, at least the way we experience them today, is not something that arises naturally out of a pure laissez-faire environment. In fact, corporations today are something that is very bound up with the state. They're protected by the state in a number of ways that I'd like to talk about, and are also created by the incentives that are provided by the state in ways that a lot of people don't realize. And libertarians, who we end up wanting to defend them because a lot of times the arguments against corporations you really come from a socialist perspective and aren't the right arguments against corporations. And I'd like to make some of what I would consider the right arguments against the corporate system and what a lot of people call corporatism. You may hear the idea that we don't live in a capitalistic society, we live in a corporatist society. And so that's where I really want to start, because the idea of capitalism is that you have private ownership of the means of production. Now, that itself is defined basically in contrast to socialism, and in some senses by socialists that want state ownership of the means of production. And so the idea of private ownership is like you own a farm. You as an individual, you own a farm. You own the things that grow on the farm, and therefore you own the fruit that comes off the trees. You own the production of the farm. You can sell it, and you have the right to keep the money from the things that you sell. Whereas state ownership would be the state owns the farm, and people work on it, and they're paid by the state, and the state distribute, So that's the main contrast there. So right away, does a corporation represent a private ownership of the means of production? And the answer is not really. At least a publicly traded corporation. And that's really what I'm going to focus on, are publicly traded corporations rather than privately owned corporations or privately owned companies. Because one of the things that I have noticed is that these two different entities tend to behave quite differently from one another. And I think there's some very good reasons why that we'll explore. So right away with a publicly owned corporation, you don't have an individual that's owning it. You have a collective of individuals, and those individuals are called the stockholders. So each person owns a stock certificate that entitles them to a percent of the equity of the firm, and the equity of the firm is defined by all the stuff it owns, like if it owns farms, as well as patents, intellectual property rights, and a right to all the profits that are produced after the capital, after the company and labor have made their competing claims. Stockholders own what's left over. That's called profit, right? So a publicly owned corporation is really a collectively owned corporation. It's just the collective is not it's not organized in a way that we usually see collectives organized, which is along geographic or ethnic lines and things like that. So rather than all the people in a particular town owning the corporation like they would with a public utility, it's really just people all over the world randomly who own stock. In fact, a lot of the people who complain about, big corporations own stock in those big corporations because they have retirement funds, and the retirement funds, one of the ways that they grow the value of the money you put in a retirement fund is they buy stocks, they buy equities, and they expect those equities to go up in value, which is one of the ways that they are able to at least preserve the money that you put into an investment account. So that's one of the things, is that it's collectively owned. And one of the consequences of collective ownership is that because each vote, as far as electing the board of representatives, which are the board of directors, which are then going to determine the trajectory of the company, if you own one piece of stock, you're essentially powerless. It's like only having one vote. Whereas people who own larger percentages have, of course, larger votes. So you have voting blocks within that. It's kind of like a little mini state is a way of viewing a corporation. Now, can a collective group of people own property? I mean, that's an interesting question. One of the ways that it's done is through a technical legal relationship with the state. And that brings me to my next point, which is that corporations are a legal fiction. A corporation does not exist. The property that it owns exists. The people who work within the system, they exist. They're individuals, their actions have things, but a corporation cannot act because it's not a person. It's a legally fictitious person. You create this idea of a corporation so that a collective of people can buy and own single pieces of property. That's why the corporation exists. And then there are some consequences as a result of that produce or can produce some really bad behaviors within corporations. And the main thing is that if the corporation owns the property and owns the business and owns the production of it, we also have the flip side of that, which is that the corporation is vicariously liable for the actions of the people that work within it. So vicarious liability means like if you own a delivery company and a delivery driver happens to crash into another car, the company is the one at fault because he was doing it on company time. He was the one driving the car as a result of the functions that he's performing as part of his corporate job. The corporation is vicariously liable. So the corporation is liable, not the individual. And if you're an individual delivery truck driver, that may actually be a really good deal for you. You don't want to be individually liable for things that may arise from doing your job. You'd rather have the company be liable and the company take care of all the liability matters, the insurance, litigation, that sort of stuff. However, there's a big consequence to that in that if you make a bad decision in your company, in your corporation, let's say executives make a bad decision and it causes the company to suffer big losses, the people who made those decisions are not responsible for their actions. Essentially, they don't have a penalty. So the people who work for the company, they experience all the upsides, but they don't experience any of the downsides. They're not liable for the mistakes that they make within it, especially when it comes to the higher up the chain you go, like executives. Executives make decisions that have big sweeping results within the corporation. And if they make the wrong decision, that can cost the company a lot of money. It could cost the company to go into bankruptcy. And that executive is not personally liable for those bad decisions. They don't lose their house. They don't lose their car. They don't lose basically anything. In fact, if you fire one of these high-paid executives, they may have what some people call a golden parachute. They've written into the contract the terms of their termination so that they still get a lot of money even when you happen to fire them, or even when the board of directors decides to oust the CEO. That CEO may leave quite rich compared to especially like the employees that are involved with the corporation. So when a company also does something bad, maybe something even maliciously bad, like poison the water, maybe they intentionally avoid disposing of hazardous material in order to save the company money, and that causes people to be poisoned. Well, the people who decided to do that don't suffer anything for it. Only the corporation does, which is a legal fiction. So it protects a lot of people from negative actions. That removes an incentive. If you're personally liable for getting rid of a hazardous material like an old battery or something like that, and you could get in trouble personally, then you are going to take extra care to make sure that you don't hurt other people because you want to, not just because you care about other people. And that's something that's quite outside of the idea of financial incentives. You actually might care about your neighbor enough to not poison him, but that neighbor could also sue you for damages. You're going to take some extra care to make sure that doesn't happen. But a company doesn't necessarily take that care, and the people that work for the company don't necessarily take that care because they get the upside without the downside. That itself is not something that arises really out of a laissez-faire system. That has to do with the relationship of the corporation and the way that the state authorizes that corporation to exist. Likewise, recently we've had a lot of talk, a lot of controversy over some game companies laying off large portions of their staff, specifically Activision Blizzard laying off like 800 different employees, some of whom had worked there for over a decade and had done their jobs and supposedly had done their jobs well, or they probably would have been terminated prior to this. They lose their jobs. I think Activision Blizzard lost like 50% of its stock value last year. They still reported really high revenues, but then they're still laying off their staff. Now, this to me represents a really interesting thing. The fact that they're like, this is bad that they're firing these employees who've had all this company loyalty. And that's that a corporation, again, is not a person. It's a legal fiction that stands in the place of a person. A person, if you were to imagine what you're actually expressing here, you're expressing a peasant feudal lord relationship, or a serf and a feudal lord, or a thrall and a nobleman. And so back in the feudal days, yeah, you had these serfs that worked on their ancestral lands, if you were a lord, and they provided you with food, and they basically pay taxes to you in the form of giving you their extra food. Of course, they got to keep the food that they grew. They grew food for themselves and grew food for you and your army. But you also had a responsibility to your serfs as a lord. So the relationship went both ways. The whole reason that you were a king or you were a lord and you commanded some men-at-arms or an army was to protect the serfs and the peasants, protect the people who paid you taxes and relied on you in a sense and provided for you. So when that sort of relationship ends up being inverted, like I think that's the attitude I see a lot, is the employees are kind of like serfs, and the board of directors are like the lords that own it, or the CEO is like the lords that gets huge salaries and huge benefit from running the company. That they refuse to have any kind of backward relationship towards the people on the bottom. That upsets a lot of people's sensibilities, but that's the nature of the corporate system. That employees essentially are serfs. They're like slaves. They have a limited ability to exercise their will within their role at the company. They have a specific job, and the company kind of likes them to be serfs because they're more easily controlled. You can get a lot of value out of them without having to pay them extra money. So what people usually trade when they're employees is they trade the potential upside, which is a lot of extra money if they're an entrepreneur, for the security of always getting the same paycheck. So if you went to somebody and you said, hey, you can get paid $2,000 a month, every month guaranteed, and you're going to do this job. Now, you could do the job badly one month or really well the next month, but you'll get paid $2,000 regardless. People tend to really gravitate towards that security versus going, hey, you can start a gardening business and maybe one month you'll make $5,000 and the next month you'll make $500, depending on how you do the business. A lot of people, shirk away from that kind of risk. So employees, in essence, are choosing, to a certain extent, a serf-like role or a peasant-like role in order to provide for their security. So when the Lord, the CEO, violates that relationship and removes the security from that person, that is a deeply upsetting thing to witness. And I point that out not to try to cast shade on people who are employees at any company and have been laid off, but to point out that's usually the trade. You're trading a little bit lower salary and honestly less money than what you produce in value for the corporation, for the security of having a job day after day, week after week, month after month, hopefully year after year. That was the traditional relationship between a long-term employee and a company, was security for production and security coming back. So you get a secure job and the company gets all your excesses and gets, you're not going to quit your company immediately and just go work for someone else. You're really bound to that company a little bit like a serf or a slave. Some people take those words and really go to the extreme and say corporate employees are slaves. They are like slaves. I don't think that's quite the case, but something that I think we all need to be aware of is that we are transitioning into, an economic reality where corporations don't view their responsibility towards the security of their employees as something that they're actually responsible for. An employee works for a set amount of money as long as you feel like you want to have their job, and then you can just fire them. In fact, in the book Anti-Fragile by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, a book I do recommend you read, he gives this example of a cab driver and his brother who's a company man. And the company man looks at the cab driver and says, your life is totally insecure because you don't know how much money you're going to make in a given month. He makes a lot of money one day, no money the next day. And it's very volatile, right? But it all kind of evens out and they both end up making about the same amount of money. The difference is after 30 years of working at the company, the company man gets laid off, he can't go find a job that makes the same amount of money as what he made at his former job. He requires an employer to end up paying him the money. He requires that relationship. So he ends up in a worse place than the cab driver, who can work even into his old age or work a couple days a week. If he's just bored, he can continue doing that job. So the more volatile and free job ends up being the more secure one over the long run, when you take into account that corporations do not act responsibly. And that's because they're not people. They don't have respect for that security trade, because they are not an actual person. They're a stand-in for a person. Going back to the Activision Blizzard thing, a lot of people get very upset about the getting rid of employees, and one of the contrasts that's been given. And I think I'm going to link a couple videos by Jim Sterling. Yes, Jim Sterling. I know you may not like him, but he has a couple of points that basically are very different from mine, and are kind of looking at this corporatist system as like some evil capitalist system, which I don't necessarily view it as, but I'll link them and you can watch it. One of the points he makes is that the executives at Nintendo took pay cuts out of their own salary when Nintendo was not doing well, because they viewed themselves as having responsibility towards the people in the company to ensure that they still had a job and they still had that security, so that Nintendo could continue making good products in the future. And I think if you look at a company like Nintendo and how they turned around by the time the Switch came out, and all the good software that they produced even for the Wii U, that's a decision that allowed Nintendo to continue making good products for the end consumer. So all of this stuff comes back to this idea that corporations are not people. And so if you imagine that you're a person, a lot of the things you do in your life you don't do for the profit motive. And this will be my final point, which is that corporations exist to enrich the stockholders, the people who collectively own it, not for other reasons that people are actually interested in. So if you're a person, a lot of the things you don't do for profit motive. You may choose where you live because you like the scenery, not because it's the cheapest place to live or produces some maximal value for you, but because there's a non-monetary value of, I like the scenery where this house is. I like the scenery where this apartment is. I like how close this apartment is to things which I like, and that has value that's extra monetary. You may, as an artist, decide that you're going to paint a picture, you're going to create a comic, or you're going to write a book, and that's a whole lot of effort, but you're doing it because there's a story that you really want to tell. You're doing it because it expresses something that's intrinsic to your soul that you need to express to other people, and you hope other people will enjoy and understand. In fact, this is what drives most of what I do. I'd say the vast majority of the things I do are not driven by a profit motive at all. And I would guess, and maybe that's because I'm an artist, but I would guess most people, even when they're driven by the profit motive, it's what they want to do with that money. What they want to do with that money is get things that are not necessarily easily understandable in monetary terms. When you have a family, that's not, you keep reading these articles about how much kids cost or something like that. So kids are not a monetary decision. They're a soul decision, right? They're a decision you do for your soul. People tithe to the church not because it yields dividends. Like, if I give God 10% of my earnings, then God will yield me dividends. No, they're doing it because they feel that the mission of the church is intrinsically a good thing, and they need to be funded in order to do that. There's a whole lot of things we do that have nothing to do with the profit motive. And so when you have a corporation, the entire purpose of a publicly traded corporation is to enrich the stockholders. That's why it exists. It exists to make money, not money for the employees, not to make good products for the consumers. Those are only sort of auxiliary. They're incidental to the main goal, which is to enrich the stockholders. And so one of the things that has happened over the years, and this is something that's a lot of people don't realize, is that because of our tax system actually incentivizes the largest corporations possible. Whenever you have a company, you want to grow it to the maximal size. Now, why? Why does our tax system do that? Well, it has to do with the difference between income and capital gains taxes. If you're a stockholder, this comes back to the stockholders. What you want to do is you want to buy the stock cheap, and you want to sell it at a high price. And so the difference between the cost that you bought it and the cost you sold it, that's your profit, and you have to pay on that capital gains taxes. Capital gains taxes are lower than income taxes. So you may hear jokes about, oh, Warren Buffett didn't pay any income tax. It's like, of course he didn't. He paid capital gains tax. When you're buying and selling stock, you pay capital gains tax, not income tax. But if a stock or a corporation pays dividends, meaning everybody who owns the stock, it pays them money, it pays them the profits, it gives it back to the stockholders, they have to pay income tax on it. So the main drive for increasing the size of the company is you take the profits and you reinvest them, you buy more equity, which increases the value of the equity certificate, the stock. So you're trying to increase the value of the equity because that benefits the stockholders. Because when they sell the stock, they have to pay less tax on it. One of the solutions to this that a libertarian economist, Milton Friedman, talked about many decades ago was corporations should be forced to pay out their excess revenues, their profits, should be forced to pay out their profits as dividends to the stockholders. And when they want to expand, they have to raise new capital to do it. And that will make it so that companies don't just grow by virtue of having their initial stage be good, and they aren't able to just grow, or they don't have an incentive to just grow out of control. One of the problems when companies grow out of control because they get bigger and bigger is you get too big to fail, which is this idea that banks have become so hegemonic. They're so big that the collapse of a bank like JP Morgan Chase would be so devastating to the economy that you can't allow it to happen. Well, why is JP Morgan Chase, was it allowed to keep growing and keep acquiring other companies with its profits? And the reason is because the stockholders wanted the maximum amount of stock value, not to be paid the dividends for them doing a good job in the short term. So if they did a good job in the short term and they paid dividends out, maybe the stockholders would want to buy another stock offering from them when the company wants to raise more capital and maybe expand. So right now the way it is that if you're a company, you don't do dividends. What you want to do is take your money and spend it and keep expanding so that it grows the value of the stock. And of course, a lot of your executives are paid in stock options. They want that too. They themselves end up acting like stockholders. And so they're going to do the things which are going to benefit the stockholders and not benefit the company or the people within the company. You have to remember that the employees are the ones really generating most of the value, and how they generate that value is controlled by the top management. But the top management wants them to generate value in a way that's going to enrich the stockholders and not enrich the customers or enrich the employees. Now, if you were to contrast that system to, an individual making, if we go back to the game industry, a couple of individuals having a small business where they own all the equity, they want to make a really good game. That's just what they want to do. They want to make a really good game. They have a vision for a really cool D&D style RPG, and they work hard on it. They produce it, and boom, it's a hit, and they make a ton of money on it, right? Now, they could follow that up and be like, okay, well, how do we make more money? Or they can be like, you know what, we're going to make a game that it's probably not going to sell as well, but we really want to make this one, and maybe people don't buy it as much, but we're going to choose to make less money to produce the product that we want. Or we're going to have a different relationship with our customers where we're going to be like, well, what do you guys really want for the next one? And maybe we'll make that. Maybe we'll try to make it as good as possible. Maybe you have a couple employees that don't like DLC and refuse to do it, right? Their company, they're like, we're not going to ever do DLC, or we're going to give away all the DLC for free. That has a really beneficial relationship to consumers and can produce a lot of connection between the people who consume the game and the people who make the game in a way that is purely capitalistic, right? It's purely people operating within their own private means to do what they want to do. But the profit motive is not the supreme thing. It's just one thing among many things for why you do something. You do things for satisfaction, to make customers happy, to make yourself happy, to produce a product that you think the world needs. There's lots of reasons why people do things. Owning the company themselves is what allows them to do it. So if you were to compare this corporatist system to socialism, there's not you wouldn't have any more freedom as an employee to make the games you wanted to under socialism. In fact, you probably have less. But if you're able to privately actually own your own company, that's when a lot of the creativity starts to happen. Now, to play the devil's advocate with myself a little bit, there's a lot of benefits to collectively owning property, which is that you can own bigger property than what an individual can reasonably own. So if you collectivize your resources, you sell some stock, you raise some capital, you now have a big company. You can make things like blockbuster movies that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a really hard thing for an individual to fund or create himself. So you get products that wouldn't exist otherwise or require the resources of many more people to be coordinated in order to produce something. So there are definite benefits to having corporations. The problem is people often just ignore all of the negatives that arise from the legal fiction known as corporations and their relationship with the state and with the tax system. So as Sears has gone into bankruptcy, a very big company, people wonder, like, how could that happen? Well, Sears would have gone into bankruptcy much earlier if we allowed that more creative destruction of the free market to happen without constantly increasing stock value. Because as you increase stock value, it takes longer for the company to collapse, and the more significant the collapse of that large company is. So it slows down that creative destruction that the free market relies on to keep good products circulating for the consumer. And anyway, those are some points I wanted to make about corporations and corporatism. So when you look at the main system that we operate under today, corporatism tends to be it. And of course, all of this is excluding the relationship that corporations may have with politicians as far as funding campaigns and lobbying the government, things that individuals themselves don't have access to. I do want to make one last point before I go, and it has to do with Citizens United. People object to Citizens United on the idea of corporate personhood. The idea of the legal fiction of the corporation is corporate personhood. But when it comes to speech, a corporation is like any collective of individuals. If you got 10 people together and you wanted to put your money together and have a political ad, you should be allowed to do that as long as people want to do that. So a corporation is just another form of collective that should be able to speak as a collective. It's not really saying that, corporations ought to be more empowered than individuals. Corporations, in essence, are individuals. It's just they're individual stockholders controlling employees rather than just 10 dudes who get together to make an ad. So that's a little bit of some thoughts on that particular decision. So anyway, leave me your thoughts down below, and I'll try to link some stuff that's kind of relevant to this, and let me know what you think about this. And I will see you guys next time. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and make sure if you're on my mailing list or you're following me on Subscribestar, I will have a new novella coming out pretty soon in the same universe as Water of Awakening, what I call the Eternal Dream Saga. So keep up to date on that, and I'll see you guys next time.